Welcome to a little special bonus edition of The Bliss of the Abyss. This is a little teaser of what's to come. The next full episode will be released this week. It'll be a two-parter featuring philosopher, doctor, friend Nils-Hennes Stear. However, this is a riposte, if you will. To those of you who heard the Konstantin episode, you'll have noted that it is perhaps a little more controversial than the usual output on this channel, and I certainly did my best to push back at some of Konstantin's ideas that I disagreed with, and I think he appreciated the lively back and forth on the debate. However, I am me, and Nils is a professor of philosophy. That being said, he also listened to the episode and was able to articulate some more erudite rebuttals to some of Konstantin's points than I was. Also, hindsight's 2020. Yeah, it's easy when you're looking back, mate. Anyway, I thought this would be an interesting balancing exercise for the podcast. So this is sort of an attempt to give some selective, maybe gentle pushback to some of the more charged political conversations between Konstantin and I. If you're interested, it was just a couple of episodes ago, episode 93, featuring Konstantin Kisin, and we discussed all kinds of things. And I think, there was a lot here to talk about and tons to discuss. And so this isn't an attack. This is perhaps more of a love letter, in fact, to the spirited debate, the topics brought up, and a rebalancing and redressing from a different side of things. So, if that sounds like it's up your street, enjoy this little mini-sode, and we'll be with you soon for the full thing.
The bliss of the abyss, it's here now.
Hey Rob, I listened to your show with Konstantin Kisin, and on the one hand thought it was really compelling, really entertaining, and the guy clearly has just a wonderful knack for delivering his ideas. And so I can totally understand why he's had the success that you were describing in the show. On the other hand, I did wish that you would have pushed back a little bit more than you in fact did, at least on occasion. And I get it. When you're there in the moment, it's hard to push back because you don't have all the epistemic resources at your fingertips. Maybe you can't think of the right sorts of counterexamples to put pressure on the speaker. And I take it the point of the show is not to be a crucible for clashing political ideas so much as just a platform to talk them through. But in any case, I thought I'd just record a couple of thoughts I had and see what you thought. So one thing that emerged time and again in this conversation was the theme of an activist left that wishes to punish people with different views or to exact conformity out of them by force. And the more I thought about that idea, the more confused about it I became, because it wasn't really clear to me what Kisin meant by punishment or by force. So I take it that every organisation in a liberal democracy has a right, and I take it Kisin would recognise this right, to engage in certain kinds of what we might broadly call editorial decisions. So whether you're a comedy club or a television broadcaster or a university, you have the right to give airtime or not, or a platform or not, to views or people that you find offensive or morally abhorrent in some other kind of way. And given that, my question that I would have for Kisin, I guess, would be, what ought one to do when someone has been given space in a newspaper, in a comedy club or wherever, to espouse views that one finds abhorrent? Should one just settle at the level of criticising the view and leaving it at that? That seems to be the position he wants to take. But suppose we think of a case where there's broad consensus about the immorality of a particular practice. Suppose there's a comedian who, as part of their routine, suppose their whole routine is a classical blackface minstrel performance. should we, in that case, just point to the performance and go, well, I don't agree with the kind of message that this comedian is communicating? Or should we ask of the kinds of venues that are hosting such a comedian to cease and desist doing so, because what they're giving airtime to and what they're giving legitimacy to is something deeply morally abhorrent? And if I'm a comedy club owner, do I have to give airtime to a performer like that, despite people's protests, because to do otherwise would be to violate a certain commitment to freedom of expression? Now, the question here is rhetorical, because I take it that we think no one is under any obligation to give airtime to these people, and we should be responsive to the kinds of well-grounded moral criticisms that people have about giving airtime to such a performer. So now the question is, if that's true in that case, then why think that the kinds of strategies that this portion of the left engages in are illegitimate as such, if there are points of view being expressed or attitudes being expressed in comedy routines or op-eds or whatever that they find similarly morally abhorrent? Aren't they under a certain moral obligation to not just criticise the performance or the message or whatever, but also to demand, to the extent that their political power allows them to, that the comedy club not give airtime to those kinds of views? So drawing on that, this idea that this portion of the left is trying to punish these people, and I don't deny that there are individuals, even large groups of individuals, who really do want to punish people with whom they disagree. But punish is such a morally loaded term, it sounds so ominous. But if you're just asking that someone who, in your eyes, is doing something morally abhorrent not be given airtime, I don't see why that's considered punishment. Because the problem isn't just the message, the problem is the providing the platform to give the message on. And for the same reason, the idea that this is being done by force strikes me as really hyperbolic, because there's no coercion required there. If someone engages in a campaign to boycott a comedy club, say, or a newspaper, or protest in a way that manifests their disagreement with giving airtime to such a person or such ideas, that seems like a perfectly legitimate thing to do. And what is the problem with doing that? We might have broader worries about the power of private institutions to make these kinds of decisions, especially when they are large institutions or have a monopoly over a certain kind of platform. But those are different worries. So maybe what's underlying Kisin's worry is a kind of thought that you see in the work of John Stuart Mill, for example, that if these kinds of viewpoints that I'm calling reactionary get snuffed out in various venues, then we can end up in this epistemically precarious situation in which we have our, as it were, morally sound positions according to a certain left-wing perspective, and we forget the reasons for those positions because we no longer engage with the viewpoints of people who don't share those positions. But if that's the source of the worry, then it seems like we are light years away from that situation. If you go in any corner shop or just turn on the TV, you are bombarded with the kinds of non-PC reactionary views that Kisin and commentators like Kisin seem to be so concerned to defend, at least in the sense of defend their right to be heard, which of course is fine. That is to say, we are not in the kind of situation where we're not hearing those thoughts or ideas being expressed. Even in the comedy circuit, you think about the transphobic portions of the routines by people like Chappelle or Gervais, however funny you might think they are, they're clearly getting airtime and also giving these artists a certain level of success. And I don't think just in spite of the criticism, but in part because of it. So the broader thought here about why it's okay to ask organisations not to give platforms to these kinds of views is tied together, I think, with the thought that in speaking or expressing ideas, we're not just conveying certain concepts and ideas, we're also performing actions in doing that. those could be either causal actions in that we elicit certain kinds of responses. Sometimes when people speak about something being offensive, they have that in mind. But they can also be constitutive actions. Kisin himself gives the example of incitement to violence or law-breaking or mass panic as when someone shouts fire in a crowded theatre. And I take it the reason he thinks that it's okay to control that form of speech is because it constitutes a certain kind of act. Maybe he wouldn't put it in that way, but it constitutes an incitement to violence, say. I think that one fruitful way of thinking about criticisms from the left of the kind that Kisin is so worried about is as being committed, at least implicitly, to the idea that certain kinds of comedy routines or certain kinds of things that you might say in an op-ed are constitutive of oppression or constitutive of the denigration of broad social groups of people. And to the extent that we have a broad social consensus that denigrating broad social groups is not morally okay, and also the kind of arena in which private individuals and organisations and maybe even state actors have a right or even a duty to prevent that sort of denigration happening. If that's the case, then it's not enough to say about a particular comedy routine that is, say, racist, that here are the things that are wrong with it, and I leave it now for you to decide whether or not you like the routine or not. But that the comedian needs to be taken off the stage, because in the very expression of the ideas, in the very performing of the routine, they are doing something so morally offensive that we as a society ought not to tolerate it. I take it that that's the view. The case of the blackface performer is supposed to bring that out. So even if you don't think that's true of Dave Chappelle or Ricky Gervais or whatever, and I'm not going to argue that it is, it's certainly true of the blackface performer. And now it's just a question about, well, at what point do we say this is sufficiently morally abhorrent that we want to do more than merely criticise and add to the marketplace of ideas about it? And we do, in fact, want to de-platform or not provide a platform to those kinds of ideas or performances in the first place. And to claim that that is authoritarian, as Kisin does about the broad ideology that I think he takes these kinds of criticisms to emanate from, that just strikes me again as unhelpfully hyperbolic, because there doesn't seem to be anything authoritarian about trying to exact a certain kind of moral conformity out of people. I mean, a bloody tax system does that already. The coercive powers of the state are used to make you fund certain kinds of policies that embody a certain particular value system. So the question we shouldn't be asking is, can we coerce a certain conformity to value systems? Because we're already on board with that idea, unless we are libertarians of the purest stripe, which I take it Konstantin isn't, given some of the things he said. So now we just have the substantive ethical and political question about which kinds of people we want to give airtime to and which kinds of messages we want to. And the people that he's concerned about, they have a particular position about which people ought to be given airtime to or not. There's nothing authoritarian about that position. I mean, they might be wrong, but I don't see why it's authoritarian at all. Oh, and one final thing. The idea that the freedom of expression and the various kinds of institutions that are built around it is the reason why the West has succeeded, I guess, in comparison with the rest of the world. Well, surely a big part of the story does overlook the fact that there were hundreds of years of colonial plunder of those other countries, which sort of went missing in Kisin's discussion. But that's a topic for another time. Anyway, sorry that went on so long. See you around.